everyone, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I am very excited to be both filming this video and just chatting through these books finally. I am doing probably one of my most requested videos at all times. Like at any point in time, I feel like this is the video I am most requested to do, and that is my favorite fantasy novels. This is a video that I like to revisit every couple of years or so. In fact, the last time I posted this video was 3 years ago. I'll link my previous versions down below, but this time around I decided to take it one step further and do my top 10 favorite fantasy books of all time. Now, before we dive into the titles themselves, I did want to do a quick disclaimer. These are my faves. I've obviously read a lot of fantasy, but I have no means read all of the fantasy. So yeah, there's still a lot of books out there to be discovered, and I'm sure my favorites list will be continuously evolving throughout the years, which is why I like to make updated versions of this video in general. And two, there's actually not going to be any YA on this list. I'm actually going to be making a separate video chatting through my favorite YA fantasy series. It was honestly just way too hard to narrow down to 10 books, so I decided to make 2 videos instead of 1. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into my top 10 favorite fantasy books. These are in no particular order because it was honestly hard enough to just narrow it down to 10. I love all of these with all of my heart, so I would highly recommend all of them. So they are just, there's no additional ranking. Let's dive in. The first series I'm going to chat about is a classic, and that is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Mistborn for me personally was one of the first epic fantasy stories I encountered and picked up, and it's always been one of my favorites. I even reread it last year and continued on with the additional trilogies, and they just hold up and they're just so excellent. I also feel like Brandon Sanderson is by far and away one of my favorite authors, and I've seen a lot of comments about being intimidated or not knowing where to start, and I always say the Mistborn trilogy is the perfect place. If you're wanting to check out Cosmere novels and you're wanting to check out Brandon Sanderson's writing, all of his books though are incredibly engaging. His writing style is super accessible and wonderful to read, not to mention his plots and magic systems are next level. But bringing me back to Mistborn, the premise of this is definitely if the bad guy won. And in the first novel, it's essentially about a ragtag group of individuals working together to overthrow this dark lord. It has lots of great characters. Vin, our main character, is a young girl, and you really see her grow up, come into her power. But one of my favorite elements outside of the twisty, turvy plot, which is definitely there, is the magic system. It's centered around the consumption of metals, and different metals have different properties and magical outputs. It's incredibly interesting, and just reading this entire trilogy is great. The first one is definitely very much a heist story, which makes it go at a blistering pace, but I would say the plot is escalated in a masterful way throughout this entire trilogy, and it's just really enjoyable. It holds up, it's a lot of fun. I love Brandon Sanderson. I've read, I think, all of his books, and this was no exception and the first book on my list. I guess the question is, should I just keep talking about Brandon Sanderson? Because he is my only repeat author on this entire top 10 list. So let's just go through his other series that is really, really heavy, and that is the Stormlight Archives, which is his epic high fantasy series, which currently has 4 books out, and I think it's going to top about 10 or 12. And these, my friends, are incredibly excellent as well. And again, like all of his books, very approachable. I would not be intimidated by these novels just because they're super long, because they're full of adventure and characters and twists and turns, and you will just love it so much. But this is an epic, to say the least, and it is a multi-POV story following a variety of different characters, all living within this world that has kind of been at an endless war. In the first one, you follow an assassin who cries as he kills, a young girl who's trying to become a scholar but secretly is trying to be a spy to help save her family from economic ruin. You follow a surgeon forced to forsake his profession to become a soldier. And last is a prince whose eyes are open to the ancient past. This is truly an epic. It's set on the stage of war. It's incredibly brutal. The magic is fascinating, both in its general application, but there's also magical items. It's just expansive, and it just will completely transport you, and you'll love every single second of it. I'm currently in the process of rereading this myself, and I can say it's great. I'm loving it very much. But yeah, Stormlight Archives, beautiful. Also just the construction of these novels. There's full page illustrations and maps. It's just high quality experience all around. Next series is a more recent discovery for me, and that is the Live Ship Traders series by Robin Hobb. The Farseer trilogy is not on this list, and that was probably the one that was so painful for me not to include it because I love Fit so much. But for me, the Live Ship Trader trilogy so far, of what I've read of Robin Hobb, is both my favorite books of hers and some of my favorite fantasy books I've simply ever read. But in general, all of her books kind of live within the same world, so I would recommend starting with the Farseer trilogy before you get to Live Ship, but I'm hoping this is a bit of a carrot to encourage you to pick that wonderful series up and then continue into this absolute masterpiece of a trilogy. But the Live Ship Traders trilogy, starting with Ship of Magic, is a very expansive multi-POV, and I mean that truly. Like, there are so many perspectives within this story, centered around the concept of ships and trading and pirates, set in a variety of different locations, and a lot of the perspectives are kind of bundled together, and then it creates these sort of disparate tales that ultimately are all tied together in such an incredibly satisfying way. But the heart of the story is about trading and family and piracy and being on the water. And normally, I'll be honest, I don't particularly care for pirate books. I'm not like really into sailing or anything like that. Robin Hobb's focus on the details of sailing like makes you feel the love that the characters have for it, and therefore you're really entertained by it. But I would say my favorite thing about Robin Hobb's writing, particularly in this series, but it's definitely present within the Farseer trilogy as well, is her characters. I think she writes the best characters in fantasy. They're complicated, they're interesting, you don't totally know what they're going to do, and the character arcs that she builds over time are some of the most satisfying experiences I have ever encountered. I have laughed, I have cried, I have been enraged by characters and their decisions within her series. I just have the most visceral reactions while reading her books because I'm so invested in their lives, and I just like don't know how they're gonna make it through. I'll also say Robin Hobb's stories are brutal. She really puts her characters through the paces. Nothing is easy. Everything is fought for, and it makes for an excellent tale. Live Ship Trader trilogy, and Robin Hobb is a author that's new to me this year, and by far and away she skyrocketed to the top of my list. This is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. If I had to make a top 3, this would be in it. I loved it so much. Robin Hobb is just a genius, okay? Next series on my list is the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. This is a recently finished grimdark fantasy story inspired by the Sino-Japanese War, the Opium Wars, as well as the Song Dynasty, and it is one of the most brutal trilogies I have ever read. But the Poppy War series primarily follows our main character Rin. In the first one, she essentially tests out of her small village to be able to attend a very elite military academy. There she trains both as a soldier but also begins to tap into shaman magic. But throughout her entire education, Rin is very much ostracized for her gender, for where she grew up, and also her complexion. At about the halfway point of the first novel, war breaks out, which is kind of what carries us through the entire trilogy. This is very much a war-focused story, and the reason why this has made my list, outside of the exceptional writing and complex and dynamic characters, if you want to be furious and confused about choices, read this book. I mean, if you want truly like gray morality, like this is the series for you. How R.F. Kuang wrote war and also portrayed the grim realities of war is just one that I have such respect for. And in general, how R.F. Kuang also wrote about strategy and decisions. It wasn't a glamorized experience. It wasn't like there's an epic great battle and there's an epic great enemy at the end of it and all we have to do is slay the Dark Lord, we win, everything's fantastic, everything's great. That is not it at all. Not only is the enemy kind of this murky force that probably has the same motivations as you, but also all of the strategic decisions that you have to make have heavy costs, and R.F. Kuang does not let us turn our back on those costs, be it civilians, soldier deaths, destruction. We have to face it just like our main characters do. This is truly a story about Rin and her closest advisors as they're really just trying to survive and make the best possible decisions to get them to victory. There are an incredible amount of battles. It is so intense and just one of the best fantasy series I've ever read. It's definitely like classic rock hard place. There seemingly never feels like a right answer. And I would say this is a very dark story, and Rin as a main character is a very complex and often one that will make the decisions that maybe you would not make, but that's what also makes her so human. This is so good. The tale itself is also rooted in such history. The historical references that the author pulls from is not just done for a background, it's integral to the plot, a lot of the commentary in terms of what she's trying to say. It's just so good. and I loved it so much. Next is a series I personally think is criminally underrated. His other series, which is currently releasing, is much more popular, but his first trilogy is still one of my favorite books I've ever read, and that is the City of Stairs trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is a series comprising of the City of Stairs, City of Blades, as well as City of Miracles, and it was just a journey from beginning to end. I describe this book as if like a geopolitical thriller was mixed with fantasy. The concept is there was once this great powerful land called the continent. And they were incredibly wealthy and also able to dominate their neighbors and other neighboring countries because of their access to the gods. The gods basically provided everything for them in terms of power and prestige, but then one day one of the neighboring lands rose up and actually killed off the gods, which resulted in this once great powerful nation completely crumbling. Imagine your entire society being fueled by gods that then disappear overnight. Your infrastructure disappears, your government disappears, half of a city might simply disappear, and you're essentially left in ruins. And in this first novel, we primarily follow our main character Shara, who works in essentially a government position within that country that killed off the gods within the continent to ensure it stays that way. They essentially prevent any circulation of folklore from this time, and they also track and make sure to do away with any rumors of gods coming back. At the beginning of the story, Shara is sent to the continent to investigate a murder, but when she gets there, she quickly realizes that it's definitely more than it seems, and so begins a tale of conspiracy, dead gods, and buried history. This trilogy is so excellent. First and foremost, each book hyper focuses on a different main character, and actually a lot of time passes between each one. And also generally they're present within a different city without the continent. The idea of them are all of the same. It's definitely exploring this deeply complicated relationship between this country that was once subjugated by the continent but is now ruling them, the destruction and the rebuilding of cities within the continent, the civilian complexity of wanting to tap into their own religion, also how those gods should maybe be feared and hold possibly way too much power. This has such pace to it. Again, I'd really describe it as a geopolitical thriller, but it has such fantastical elements to it as well. It also has such a human component, again, because each book hyper focuses on a different main character. You dive deep into that character's psyche, and as they're trying to figure out what is the best decision, because again, all of these issues are incredibly complicated and specific to wherever they are within the continent itself. All the characters are also tied, so it's not that you never visit another character again. I just feel like this was one of the greatest fantasy series I've ever read. It's really unique as well. I'm sort of tapping into current geopolitical politics and kind of meshing it with this sort of alternate world where gods lived. I just thought it was so well done. I loved it. It's so good. Please read it. I feel like no one reads this and it definitely deserves to be read. Next is another series that would probably make my top 3 if I had one, and that is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. N.K. Jemisin in general is one of my all-time favorite fantasy writers. I've read so many of her books, and I would say read them all. My favorite is probably the Broken Earth trilogy, but seriously, every single one of them are excellent and worth checking out. This particular trilogy will mess with you. It's set in a world where civilization is constantly ending by like world-altering catastrophes, usually in the form of major earthquakes or volcanic eruptions that literally end civilization and they have to restart from scratch. Because of this, society has kind of progressed in a way to prepare for the end of the world. Socially, that means there are small, tight-knit communities where everyone has specific roles and jobs. In general, there are certain scenarios that people are taught in terms of how to survive. On top of this, there's also individuals in this world with magic that essentially they can control the tremors of the earth, but instead of kind of being revered as possible saviors to help prevent a future catastrophe, they're instead viewed with a lot of suspicion and are deeply controlled by the government. Within this first novel, you follow a variety of perspectives: a mother who's trying to find her daughter, a young girl who's just discovered her powers, and a young student who is kind of learning how to control her powers. This trilogy is a journey. I feel like the setup seems simple, but everything that goes down within this series is the opposite of that. The magic is fascinating in terms of the topics that N.K. Jemisin touches on: race, motherhood, gender, identity. It's got it all. He holds back no punches. Just the care and the skill that this trilogy was constructed with shines. I mean, there's a reason why each one won the Hugo Award, because each one is genius, to put it simply. Again, one of my favorite trilogies of all time. Just one that will break you into a million pieces and laugh at you. Read it. Next series on my list is the Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee. I think this is my only true urban fantasy select for this particular list. In general, I would say urban fantasy is not my favorite subgenre of fantasy, but when I do read it, I want it to be like the Green Bone Saga, which is simply one of the most entertaining, action-packed stories I have ever read. There are currently 2 books out. I've read both and they're both incredibly excellent. But for context, this is an Asian-inspired urban fantasy story set on a fictional land called Kekon. There, this city is basically controlled by 2 major crime families, and how these 2 crime families maintain and hold their power is through jade. In this world, jade can be worn and grant some individuals inhuman-like power and strength and speed, but not everyone can wear it. However, at the beginning of the story, a new drug kind of enters the market, which allows kind of the average person to be able to wear and use jade. This sort of creates a lot of tension between these 2 crime families, as both of them are vying for ultimate power within this city. Throughout Jade City and throughout Jade War, the sequel, you follow a variety of perspectives primarily within the Cal family, which is part of the No Peak clan, one of the most powerful families in the city of Kekon. This is a story that is gruesome, full of family drama, family dynamics. Also, the author, I think, is trained in martial arts, and you can see that shine within its pages because how the combat is written, it's so smooth and visual. This is a story of like bad people doing bad things, but it's also so much fun. It's fast-paced, it'll give you whiplash. The first 2 books were so good. Like crime family, family drama, it will leave you entertained and breathless. I love this series so much. To me, if I'm gonna read urban fantasy, I want it to be like this. This was amazing. All right, the next book on my list is a classic. I'm sure many of you guys have heard of it, but I obviously have to include it as it's one of my favorites, and that is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. A true modern fantasy masterpiece, if you will. This is a trilogy, I think it's supposed to be. The 3rd book has a very mysterious release date. I don't know when it's coming out, and I don't think anyone does. So I would say, I caution you if you want to pick this up for the first time, because you might be joining a special club where we're all just waiting anxiously for that final release. But The Name of the Wind is a wonderful story that primarily focuses on the main character, Kvothe. The story itself opens up on Kvothe being kind of a tavern bartender, and a chronicler comes in and begins to ask him about his life. So he kind of has this unassuming job in a small town, but as he begins to recount his life and story, you realize that Kvothe is actually a really powerful wizard that has gone on many quests and has tried and possibly failed at saving the world. Throughout books 1 and 2, you follow as Kvothe recounts his childhood, his schooling at a magical school, as well as some of his early conflicts. All in all, I would say the story is obviously very hyper-focused on one particular character, and there's this really interesting tension between the past and what we currently know as the present, because obviously we're building up to something that is some sort of fallout if Kvothe is now in hiding and a bartender in a small faraway town. And overall, I would say probably my favorite part about this book is actually Patrick Rothfuss's writing. I find his prose to just be so lyrical, not to mention really homey. There's something about this tale that just feels really inviting to me. Following Kvothe throughout his entire life as a character, he's a really easy one to root for in my opinion, and the fact that this book primarily takes place in large part at a magic school also is just like a favorite fantasy trope that I just can never get enough of. So yes, The Name of the Wind is on my top list. I know, so original, but it's here for a reason, because it's a great book. All right, we're down to our final 2 series. I'm now realizing I should probably call this book my top 10 favorite fantasy series, because they're all that. But I have the Gentleman Bastard series, first one being The Lies of Lockemora by Scott Lynch. This is a wonderfully fast-paced and a lot of fun, primarily following our main character Lockemora and his crew, his merry band of men, kind of creating a lot of mischief and problems for everyone else or wherever he happens to be at that time. He's essentially the ultimate thief. He's constantly trying to trick and steal everything and anything he can possibly think of. And in this first novel, we actually follow Locke as he's a young child, both kind of beginning to forge those relationships and also gain those skills as a thief he later uses in his life. And those chapters are actually interspersed with current day, as he's also trying to pull off the most extreme heist of all time, essentially tricking and stealing from different gang leaders within the city. This also has such a great vibe and atmosphere. I would very much describe it as some sort of like historical Venetian, lots of canals, merchant house, trading politics kind of tale. This series honestly is just one that is so much fun and is personally at least tricking me on like every other page. I love just seeing Locke's ideas slowly unwind and kind of seeing all the pieces fall together. It's just super, super satisfying. I also just love seeing the relationship too between Locke and Jean. It's just fun, funny, and just a heist tale that you don't want to put down. Locke would steal all of my stuff and I'd probably let him. All right, pals, we did it. We've reached the last book in this top 10 list, and that is going to be the Davabad Trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, the first one being City of Brass. I love this fantasy trilogy so much. It is a very much political focus, but definitely has so much magic and culture at its heart as well. This is a multi-POV story following a lot of different characters from different political and like power alliances within this world, which is what makes it so interesting. One of our main characters is Nahari, and this book actually opens in 18th century Cairo, where we follow her and she kind of makes her way as a con woman, kind of tricking people out of their livelihood. In the first book though, she accidentally summons a warrior djinn, and then from there she's transported to a magical city of Davabad. There she learns about her hidden magic and hidden heritage as being part of a once very powerful family, which kind of begins to turn the politics in this world on its head. That's because the city has honestly been simmering in conflict for centuries and political division, both between the different social groups as well as religious groups that live within this one central city. There's so much distrust and hatred on all sides. It's an incredibly complicated political issue, resulting in an incredibly heartbreaking and complicated political issue that is definitely played out over the course of 3 books. But don't get me wrong, this is not just a political-based fantasy. There is so much magic and wonder present within this tale as well, and so many characters you'll fall in love with. There's also dynamic and interesting relationships, a touch of romance. It's one that is just transportive and will entirely sweep you away. I loved it so much. And also the Middle Eastern inspired fantasy setting I felt like was so well constructed and interesting. I love this series and it was just great from beginning to end. It's finished as well, so you can marathon it and enjoy it for yourself. Not gonna lie, I'm a little out of breath, but that is my top 10 favorite fantasy series of all time. Please let me know down below some of your favorites, as I would love to know, and I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye.